It was early autumn when my friends and I decided to take a camping trip up in the mountains. The leaves had just begun to turn, and the air had that crisp bite to it that makes you think of bonfires and long hikes. We'd picked a spot near a small lake, a place none of us had been to before, but had heard about from a guy at the outdoor store. The location sounded perfect. Secluded, peaceful, with some decent fishing. We thought it'd be the perfect getaway from the noise of our everyday lives. We arrived just as the sun was setting, casting everything in that soft golden light. The lake stretched out before us, a few ducks drifting lazily across the water. The trees around the area were dense, their trunks thick and gnarled. We set up camp in a small clearing near the edge of the water, with our tents arranged in a circle. I remember looking around, taking in the quietness of the place. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I pushed the thought away. We spent the evening cooking dinner over a campfire, the smell of roasting marshmallows mixing with the wood smoke. It was just like any other camping trip, with the usual chatter and laughter. We talked about old memories, joked around, and planned a hike for the next day. The sky darkened, the stars slowly appearing overhead, and the temperature dropped. As the fire burned down to embers, we decided to turn in for the night. I crawled into my sleeping bag, feeling warm and snug. The rustling of the leaves outside the tent mixed with the occasional call of a distant owl. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that crept over me. I chalked it up to being out in the woods, where the sounds can sometimes play tricks on your mind. I turned over and shut my eyes, hoping to fall asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. My first thought was that I was cold, but then I realized something was wrong. The sounds outside had stopped. No more rustling leaves, no more animal calls. It was dead quiet, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. I lay there in the dark, trying to shake the feeling that something was off, but the longer I listened, the more I felt like something was watching us. It wasn't a normal quiet, felt heavy. I tried to shake off the unease, but it lingered. I rolled over, trying to focus on the warmth of my sleeping bag, but then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I held my breath, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time. My heart started to race. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a small animal. It was something larger, something that knew we were there. I stayed as still as I could, straining to hear more, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. My mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. I tried to convince myself, but the feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. My mind kept going back to the same thought. Something was out there. I couldn't sleep anymore. Every small sound outside made me jump. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, but my nerves were shot. I finally decided to get out of the tent and check. I slowly unzipped the door, careful not to make any noise, and stepped out into the cold night air. The campfire was just a few glowing embers now, casting faint light around the campsite. The world was still as death. Not a single animal sound. I could hear my own breathing, loud in my ears. I stood there for a moment, staring out into the darkness. The trees loomed tall around us, their shadows stretching like dark fingers. There was nothing, no movement, no sounds, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something big, watching. I wasn't sure what to do. I wanted to go back into the tent, but I also didn't want to be the one who seemed paranoid. Maybe I was overthinking it, but then I heard it again, a soft rustling. This time it was coming from the trees on the far side of the campsite, just beyond the reach of the firelight. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a raccoon. This was bigger. It sounded like something walking, slow and deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound stopped suddenly. I stood there, waiting, trying to listen for any sign of movement. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced over at the tents. I could see the dim outlines of my friends, all still asleep. I didn't want to wake them up and sound crazy, but at the same time, I couldn't just ignore it. I took a few careful steps toward the sound. My foot landed on a twig, and I cursed under my breath, hoping it hadn't given me away. I held my breath, waiting for a response. Nothing. The rustling had stopped again. I tried to peer into the darkness, but it was so thick I could barely make out the shapes of the trees. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the woods. I jumped, my heart in my throat. It came from somewhere deeper in the woods. Something had broken a branch, something big. The sound sent a jolt of adrenaline through my body. I backed away from the trees, my mind racing. I glanced back at the camp. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but that crack, it had sounded too intentional. I turned back toward the darkness, trying to see if anything was moving. The forest was still, but then I saw it. A shadow moving between the trees. It wasn't an animal, not like anything I'd seen before. It was too tall, too unnatural in the way it moved. It shifted between the trees, its outline barely visible in the darkness. I felt a chill run through me. There was no doubt in my mind now. Something was out there. I slowly backed toward the tents, never taking my eyes off the movement. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I got closer to the tents, and the shadow seemed to follow, staying just out of sight. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran back to the tents, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I dove into my tent and zipped it up quickly, my hands shaking. I lay there in the dark, trying to calm my breathing. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. It felt like the darkness was pressing in on me, suffocating. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there, listening to the silence, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But every time I heard the smallest noise, my heart skipped a beat. Every time the wind moved the trees, I tensed up. Morning came and I was exhausted. The others started stirring, rubbing their eyes, unaware of the terror I had felt the night before. I didn't tell them. I didn't want to sound crazy. Instead, I made up some excuse about hearing a branch fall. They didn't seem to question it. We spent the rest of the day fishing and hiking around the lake, trying to enjoy the day. But my mind kept wandering back to the night before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when we were sitting around the fire again, joking and talking, that I finally told one of my friends what had happened. He listened, his face serious. "You didn't hear anything last night?" he asked. I shook my head. No, it was dead quiet. He frowned and then glanced over at the edge of the woods. "You know, I thought I heard something earlier. A snap, like a branch breaking." My stomach sank. I wasn't the only one. We both sat in silence, listening. But there was nothing. No more rustling. No more cracking branches. It was like the woods had returned to their normal state, calm and peaceful. The rest of the trip went by without incident. We packed up and left the campsite the next day, and I felt a strange sense of relief. I didn't know what had happened that night, but whatever it was, it had stayed away after that first night. I never went back to that spot again. Every time I think about it, I get that uneasy feeling, like there's something in those woods I'll never understand. But I'll never forget the way it felt to be watched, to know that there was something out there, something big and quiet, waiting for the right moment to move. I'm just glad it never came close enough to show itself. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, a quick escape from the chaos of everyday life. I had been feeling burned out lately, work, home life, and everything in between, and the idea of getting away from it all seemed perfect. The plan was to camp by the lake, just a couple of friends and I. We'd be close enough to the town if anything went wrong, but far enough to forget about everything. No cell service, no distractions, just us, the wilderness, and the crackling of the campfire. We arrived at the campsite around noon, the air still warm with the fading summer heat. There was a slight breeze that rustled the leaves, but it was nothing alarming. The sun was high, casting sharp shadows across the forest floor. The path leading to the lake was a mix of dirt and old pine needles, and it smelled earthy and fresh, like something alive and untouched. The ground sloped down toward the water, where the trees thinned out and the lake stretched out like a mirror. Setting up camp was easy enough. We picked a spot beneath a row of tall pines, their trunks thick and dark against the pale blue sky. The campsite was secluded, just a small clearing among the trees, with a view of the lake a few yards away. We had our tents pitched in no time, and a fire ring was already in place, its stones cold and gray, waiting for a fire to breathe life back into it. The afternoon passed quickly. We spent time by the lake, skipping rocks, joking around, and just enjoying the quiet. The water was so still that it looked like glass, except for the occasional ripple caused by a fish jumping or a breeze skimming over it. It was beautiful, perfect even, as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting a warm orange glow over the landscape. We gathered firewood and built the fire. The first crackle of burning wood was satisfying, filling the air with that comforting smell of smoke and pine. We settled around the fire, pulling our camp chairs close, and started talking about everything and nothing. The sky darkened quickly, and the temperature dropped. We threw another log on the fire, the flames dancing higher, casting flickering shadows around the campsite. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of the leaves in the trees above us. That's when I first noticed it, an odd sound, faint but distinct. It wasn't quite like an animal, not exactly, but something about it made my skin crawl. It was a soft rustling, almost like a person moving through the brush, but it was coming from the far side of the campsite, just outside the range of the firelight. First, I thought it was nothing. The forest is full of strange noises, especially at night. The wind, animals, even the trees themselves can create sounds that are easy to misinterpret. But then the noise came again. This time, it was closer, a soft crunching sound, like someone stepping on dry leaves. My heart started to beat a little faster, and I glanced over at my friends, but they didn't seem to notice. They were too caught up in the fire, the warmth, the familiar comfort of the campfire. I stayed still, listening. The sound wasn't rhythmic like an animal, more irregular, as if whoever or whatever it was moving cautiously, trying not to make noise. But the forest was quiet, too quiet. I could feel a sudden tension in the air, something hanging just out of reach, like the calm before a storm. Another crackle from the fire. The tension lifted, only to return moments later, when the noise came again. This time, it was followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy brushing against the branches. Whatever it wasn't trying to hide anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal, but the more I listened, the more uneasy I felt. My instincts were screaming at me, urging me to get up, check the perimeter, make sure we were safe. But I stayed frozen, my eyes scanning the edges of the firelight, waiting for a glimpse of movement. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the bushes, closer now, followed by what sounded like a low grunt, something deep and throaty. My blood ran cold. That didn't sound like any animal I knew, and it certainly didn't sound like a deer. I stood up slowly, trying not to draw attention. I didn't want to alarm my friends yet, not until I was sure. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag, its beam cutting through the dark like a blade. I walked a few steps away from the fire, moving quietly, trying not to make a sound. The air was cold now, the night settling in quickly. I scanned the area, but the beam of light only illuminated the trees, their shadows stretching long across the ground. The rustling had stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then I heard it again. The noise was louder now, almost like something was breathing heavily, moving just beyond my reach. It was a sound I couldn't quite place, but it made my chest tighten. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I told myself it was just a bear, maybe a boar. They sometimes roamed through these parts, but I'd never heard one make such a sound. It was too deliberate. I turned back toward the fire, and that's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved. Fast, too fast. It was a shadow, but the wrong kind of shadow, like it didn't belong there. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, flashlight still in my hand. The shadow passed by the edge of the firelight, just barely visible. But there, it was tall, taller than a person, and it moved with a kind of strange, unnatural fluidity. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted back to the fire, my feet pounding against the ground, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure if I was running from the thing in the dark or from the fear that gripped me so tightly I could hardly breathe. I burst into the circle of light, my friends turning to look at me, startled. I must have looked like a mess, wild-eyed and out of breath. I didn't care. All I wanted was to be near the fire, to feel the heat, to know I wasn't alone in the dark. But the fear didn't leave. It lingered, thick and heavy in the air. The fire flickered in front of us, but it didn't feel as safe as it should have. It didn't seem to push back the darkness like it normally did. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. My friends exchanged uneasy looks. They hadn't heard anything. They laughed it off at first, but their smiles faded when I told them what I had seen. They asked if I was sure, if I was just spooked by the dark. But there was no mistaking it. I had seen something, and it wasn't human. We didn't stay outside much longer after that. The fire felt small and fragile, surrounded by the vast, dark forest. I had never been so aware of the night before. The air felt oppressive, and the silence was suffocating. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We retreated into our tents for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the trees, every gust of wind, every shadow seemed to carry with it the weight of something watching us. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the dark fabric of the tent above me, feeling the cold creep into my bones. In the morning, we packed up quickly. The night had drained the fun from the trip. I could feel my nerves still on edge as we broke down the campsite, the sense of something being wrong lingering in the air. We didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't need to. I never did find out what it was that night. We left the forest behind, but the unease stayed with me, a constant reminder that the woods weren't as friendly as they seemed. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe it was something else, something darker, something that I would never be able to explain. But the truth is, some things don't need to be explained. Sometimes, it's enough to feel it, to know that the darkness is never as far away as we think. I was 22 when I decided to go camping alone in the Adirondacks. I'd been to a lot of parks, a lot of campgrounds, but this was my first time camping completely off-grid. I had been hiking for hours, my pack heavy with supplies, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a few books, and my trusty pocket knife. I had no set trail in mind. I just wanted to get deep into the woods, far from any trailheads or crowded campsites, to find my own peace. It was just me, the woods, and the endless sky. The sun was low in the sky as I found a spot to set up camp. I'd made good time, so I was feeling confident, maybe a little too confident. I'd walked a good 10 miles that day, and my legs were sore, but the thought of the solitude kept me going. The woods were peaceful. The air was cool and clean, filled with the smell of pine and earth. There was no one around for miles, just the sounds of wind rustling through the leaves and the occasional bird calling out in the distance. I pitched my tent in a small clearing near a stream. The water was crystal clear, running gently over rocks, a peaceful and soothing sound. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow through the trees. I set up a small fire using the dry kindling I'd gathered on my hike. The flames flickered and crackled, casting shadows on the trees around me. Everything felt perfect. I sat by the fire for a while, cooking some canned beans and watching the flames dance. The woods around me felt safe, calm. Everything was as it should be. But as the night wore on, something started to shift. It started with a feeling I couldn't shake. It was like I wasn't alone anymore. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, maybe a product of the quiet and isolation. But the feeling grew stronger. Every time I glanced up from the fire, I thought I saw something moving between the trees, just out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look directly, nothing was there. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the wind, or maybe an animal. But the feeling didn't go away. It was like someone or something was watching me. I decided to go into the tent, hoping to shake off the unease. The darkness outside was thick now, and I could feel the air cooling rapidly. I zipped myself into the tent, lying back on the ground, listening to the soft rush of the stream and the crackling of my fire. But still, that nagging feeling was there. It was so quiet, so still, it felt unnatural. My mind kept going to the worst-case scenarios. Maybe someone else had come out here, someone who didn't belong, someone with bad intentions. But I told myself to relax. I was a grown adult, far from any city, and surely nothing would happen. The wind picked up slightly, making the trees sway in a soft, creaking rhythm. I tried to close my eyes, hoping sleep would come, but every sound seemed amplified. The wind, the crack of branches, even the distant hoot of an owl. All of it made me jump. Eventually, I started to doze off, my eyes half closed when I heard it, a twig snapping. At first, I thought it was just a random noise, but then I heard it again, a soft crunch of leaves and twigs, followed by the faint sound of something moving through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, listening intently. The sound was slow, deliberate. Whatever it wasn't just passing by. It was getting closer. I could feel my pulse quicken. I slowly unzipped the tent just a bit, enough to peek out. The fire was still burning brightly, casting a warm glow in the immediate area, but beyond that, the woods were swallowed by shadows. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it. The slow, measured steps of something moving through the forest. The wind howled briefly, causing the trees to groan and the branches to sway ominously. I held my breath, listening, trying to make sense of the noise. Was it an animal? A bear? Maybe? Or something else? I decided to take a risk. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam weak but steady, and shone it into the darkness where I had heard the sounds. The beam swept across the trees, the rocks, the underbrush, but there was nothing there. No movement, nothing out of the ordinary. I exhaled, telling myself that it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. Whatever it was, it had moved on. But then the silence returned, and with it, that feeling. The one I couldn't shake. Something wasn't right. I lay back down, clutching the flashlight, staring at the ceiling of my tent. The sounds of the forest had become muffled, as if everything was holding its breath, waiting. Minutes dragged on, and I was just about to drift back to sleep when I heard something again. This time it was closer, the unmistakable sound of something large, heavy, moving through the forest. But this wasn't the random rustling of leaves anymore. It was the sound of something walking carefully, almost silently. I didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow. I could feel the tension in the air, the way everything seemed to hold still. Whatever it was right outside the tent. Then I heard it, a low grunt, almost like a growl, from the direction of the trees just beyond my tent. My blood went cold. This wasn't a deer. It wasn't a raccoon. It was something bigger, something dangerous. I lay frozen, my mind racing. What should I do? Should I call for help? Should I grab my knife and make a run for it? The thought of running into the woods, blindly, terrified me more than the idea of staying in the tent. If I ran, I could get lost or worse, lead whatever was right to me. The growling sound continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I strained my ears, trying to hear any other sounds. The growling had been close, too close. Minutes passed, but the sounds never returned. I started to wonder if I had imagined it, if I had just been hearing things. But something told me to stay alert. Finally, I couldn't take the tension any longer. I quietly unzipped the tent, only a crack, enough to peek outside again. The fire had burned down to a small pile of glowing embers, casting long shadows across the clearing. The trees were still, and the air felt unnaturally quiet. There was no movement, no sounds of wildlife, just the echo of my own breath in the still night. I stayed there in that position for a long time, trying to make sense of everything. But my mind couldn't focus, kept drifting back to that growl, that moment of pure, paralyzing fear. Eventually, I decided I couldn't stay out there any longer. I needed to get back to civilization. I needed to leave. I packed up my tent as quickly and quietly as I could, not even bothering to take down the fire. I was shaking, my hands fumbling with the stakes and ropes as I packed away my things. But the whole time, I felt that unease, that sense of being watched, never leaving. I had no choice but to hike out in the dark. I knew the path I'd come from wasn't far, just a few miles back to a trailhead where I could find my car. But the walk felt like it took hours, every snap of a twig making my heart race, every rustle in the underbrush sending me into a panic. The whole hike back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, that I was being hunted. I didn't dare look behind me, but I couldn't stop myself from hearing those sounds. The growl, the rustling, the slow, deliberate footsteps. When I finally made it to the trailhead, the first thing I did was turn on the car lights. I was out of the woods. I didn't look back. I drove home that night, my body on autopilot, my mind too exhausted to even process what had happened. But even now, years later, I still think about that night. I still feel the weight of those footsteps behind me, the growl that echoed in the trees. And most of all, I remember the silence that followed. The silence that seemed to say, "You're not alone here." The air was cool as we set up camp. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. Just me and a couple of friends, getting out of the city, away from all the noise, into the mountains. I remember how peaceful it was when we first arrived. The wind whispered through the pines, and the birds chirped their lazy melodies. It felt like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. We picked a spot near a small creek that wound its way through the trees, a perfect place to set up our tents. The ground was soft and damp, and as I unpacked my gear, I could hear the distant sound of water rushing over rocks. It was calming. We were all in our late 20s, confident and accustomed to the outdoors. None of us were scared of a little hiking or setting up camp in the wild. The first night passed without incident. We built a fire, made dinner, and sat around it, talking about everything and nothing. As the stars began to appear in the sky, the temperature dropped, and the fire crackled as if it were alive. It was a perfect night, the kind where you can hear every crack of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, but it was also the kind of night where you're so relaxed you don't think twice about those sounds. After some time, we went to bed. I was in a tent with two of my friends, and the other two were in the tent next to ours. We fell asleep quickly, the sound of the creek lulling us into a peaceful rest. The night wasn't quiet for long. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a strange noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it was too distinct, too rhythmic. It sounded like footsteps, slow and heavy, just outside our tent. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a branch snapping in the distance. My heart started racing. I was trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something harmless. But then the footsteps stopped, and I heard the unmistakable sound of something or someone breathing. I froze, not sure what to do. The breathing was so close, I could almost feel it on my skin. It wasn't the normal heavy breathing of a person trying to stay quiet. It was deep, labored, like something large was standing there, just waiting. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. My mind was racing. Should I wake up the others? Should I check it out? No, that would be stupid. I stayed as still as I could, waiting, hoping whatever it was would just go away. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I listened intently, straining to hear the slightest movement, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. Minutes passed, and then I dared to move. I reached for my flashlight, the beam shaky in my hands as I flicked it on and aimed it at the entrance of the tent. The light flickered, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw nothing. But the silence that followed was worse than any noise could have been. It was as if the forest itself had gone still, waiting for something to happen. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned to my friends in the tent, but they were still sound asleep. I wanted to wake them, to tell them what I had heard, but something inside me said not to. If whatever it was came back, I didn't want them to panic. I was trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, that I had simply heard the wind or a falling branch. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. The hours dragged on in that eerie, suffocating quiet. Every time I thought I might have imagined it, the thought of that breathing would return, louder than ever. It wasn't until just before dawn that I finally managed to fall back asleep, my mind too exhausted to keep racing. When I woke up, it was still dark, but the first light of dawn was starting to filter through the trees. I wasn't sure what time it was, but I could tell by the low, golden light that the night was over. I felt like I had barely slept, my body stiff and sore from laying still for so long. I wasn't sure if I should tell my friends about what had happened. They had all slept soundly, and I didn't want to freak them out. But when I stepped outside the tent, I immediately noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt around our campsite. Large, deep impressions that weren't there when we had set up the night before. They weren't the kind of marks left by animals either. These were too big, too human-shaped, and they circled our campsite, stopping just short of the tents. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. I wasn't imagining things. Something had been out there. Something had been watching us. I called the others over to see the tracks. They all agreed it was unsettling, but no one seemed to take it as seriously as I did. We spent the rest of the morning making breakfast, trying to push the unease aside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in these woods. That afternoon, we decided to take a hike. We needed to shake off the tension, to clear our minds. The trail was a bit more rugged than we had expected, and after a few hours of climbing, we found ourselves deep in the forest. It was the kind of place where the trees were thick, their branches twisting high above, blocking out the sun. The forest floor was soft with moss and fallen leaves. It felt like we had stepped into another world, one that had never been touched by human hands. As we hiked deeper into the woods, I noticed something else, something that made my stomach turn. There were signs of recent disturbance in the underbrush, broken twigs, crushed leaves, and gouges in the bark of trees. It looked like something had been moving through the woods recently, something big. I didn't say anything, but I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching from the shadows. But all I could hear was the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. We hiked for hours, eventually finding a small clearing with a view of the mountains in the distance. It was beautiful, and for a while, I almost forgot the feeling of dread that had settled over me. But then I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement in the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I turned quickly, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was just a deer, or maybe a bird, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't loosen. We stayed in the clearing for a while, but the sun was beginning to set, and we decided it was time to head back to camp. The hike back was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every time I looked behind me, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows, but when I turned around, nothing was there. By the time we made it back to camp, the sky had darkened, and the forest was alive with sounds. The rustling of animals in the underbrush, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional howl of a distant coyote. That night, we made sure the fire was blazing and kept a watchful eye on the surrounding woods. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. Every crack of a branch or snap of a twig had me on edge. We all stayed close to the fire, talking quietly, trying to pretend everything was normal. But as the night went on, the feeling that we weren't alone became impossible to ignore. The forest seemed to press in around us, and I kept hearing footsteps just beyond the firelight, soft but deliberate. I wanted to believe it was just the wind, but I knew better. Something was out there. Around midnight, the others decided to turn in. I stayed up for a while, watching the flames dance and flicker, my mind racing with all sorts of thoughts. What if someone was out there? What if they were waiting for the right moment to strike? I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, just beyond the trees. This time, I wasn't going to ignore it. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound, but the light only revealed the empty darkness of the woods. The footsteps stopped. For the rest of the night, I stayed alert, my senses on high alert, listening for any hint of movement. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but when I woke up the next morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, and the forest was still. We packed up and left the campsite early, none of us speaking much as we broke down the tents and packed our gear. The tracks around our campsite were gone, but the sense of unease lingered in the air. It wasn't until we were miles down the trail, safe in the car and heading home, that I finally let out the breath I had been holding. As much as I wanted to forget what happened, I couldn't. The footsteps, the breathing, the feeling of being watched, it was all too real. I couldn't shake the thought that we had been in danger that night, but I was glad to be leaving those woods behind. I don't know who or what had been out there, but I was just glad I never found out. I never thought a simple camping trip could turn into something so terrifying. It was supposed to be an escape, a way to clear my head after a tough few weeks. I had everything planned out. A weekend with just me, the wilderness, and my tent. No distractions, no stress, just nature. I'd chosen a quiet, secluded spot, tucked in a valley near some old woods, a few miles from the nearest town. It was far enough to feel isolated, but close enough in case anything went wrong. Felt perfect. I set up camp late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the mountains. The air was crisp, the trees whispered in the wind, and everything seemed peaceful. My tent was small but cozy, just enough space for me and my backpack full of supplies. I'd brought my usual camping gear: sleeping bag, stove, a few cans of food, and my trusty pocket knife. The firewood I gathered earlier was stacked neatly, waiting for the night to settle in. The first few hours passed without incident. I cooked a simple meal of pasta, watching the flames flicker in the campfire. The sounds of the forest were all around me: the crackling of the fire, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant calls of birds. There was something comforting about it all. I felt at peace, alone with my thoughts. As the night wore on, I felt the temperature drop, and the stars began to appear, brighter than I'd ever seen. I sat by the fire, warming my hands, letting my mind wander. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling coming from the trees behind me. It was soft at first, like the wind pushing through the leaves, but then it stopped. I didn't think much of it at the time. Probably just an animal, I reasoned. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. I tried to brush it off, but something in the back of my mind told me to stay alert. The woods were full of life, after all. I kept my eyes on the fire, but my thoughts wandered again, and that's when I heard it again. Louder this time, definitely not the wind. This was something deliberate, moving through the trees. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to peer into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The fire cast long shadows, but beyond that, everything was pitch black. I grabbed my flashlight from the tent and flicked it on, scanning the area. The beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing, just trees. I held my breath for a moment, listening. No more rustling. It was dead silent. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my nerves. After all, I was alone in the woods at night. It's easy to let your imagination run wild in that kind of solitude. But as I sat back down by the fire, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. It was subtle at first, but the longer I stayed there, the more I felt it. My skin prickled, my senses heightened. Then came the sounds again, this time closer. I froze. It was definitely something big, moving through the underbrush, heavy footsteps crunching through the leaves. The sound was unmistakable. Whatever it was no small creature. I stood up slowly, trying to make out the shape of it in the dark. For a moment, the sound stopped. My heart was in my throat. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I knew then that I wasn't just imagining things. Something was out there. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the noise. My beam swept over the trees, scanning every inch of the shadows. But there was nothing, just trees, branches, and darkness. I sat back down, breathing hard now, trying to stay calm. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe it was a moose. but I didn't have any way of knowing for sure. I wasn't in any immediate danger, or at least that's what I told myself. But the noises kept coming. Now they were constant, almost rhythmic. Something was moving closer. I could hear the brush breaking underfoot, the deep, steady sound of something heavy walking in the woods. My pulse quickened, and I reached for my pocket knife instinctively. It wouldn't do much against a large animal, but it made me feel a little more secure. The footsteps stopped again. Dead silence. I strained to hear, but nothing came. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight, almost desperate to see anything, but the night remained still. I was starting to convince myself it was just an animal, a deer or something, and I'd overreacted. I let out a slow breath, trying to calm my racing heart. But just as I was about to sit down again, I heard it. A low growl, deep, guttural, and chilling. The sound came from somewhere behind me, off to the left. It was close, too close. I didn't wait to see what it was. I grabbed my backpack, yanked it into the tent, and zipped it up. My heart was hammering in my chest. There was no way I was staying out there any longer. I wasn't sure what was out there, but I wasn't about to find out. I flicked the flashlight off and crouched inside the tent, my mind racing. The growl had sounded too close. I could still hear the soft crunch of something moving through the underbrush, but it was far enough now that I couldn't tell where it was. I huddled in the corner of the tent, straining to hear. I knew there was a risk of animals coming close to campsites, but this felt different. It felt like whatever was out there was watching me, studying me. The growl was a clear warning. Whatever it wasn't scared of me. Minutes stretched on. I didn't dare move. Every sound seemed magnified. My hands were clammy, my body tense, as I waited for whatever was out there to make its move. Then, as if on cue, the sounds started up again. This time, it wasn't just one animal. There were more footsteps from multiple directions, coming closer. The noise was spreading out, surrounding me. My mind raced. What were they? Wolves? Coyotes? Something worse? I reached for my flashlight again, flicked it on, and shone it out of the tent. The beam cut through the darkness, catching a glint of eyes. There were two of them. No, 3, 4. They were too big to be coyotes, too small to be bears. I couldn't see them clearly, but their eyes glowed in the beam. They moved silently, circling the tent. I could hear their breathing now, short, sharp intakes of air. Not quite growls, not quite barks, but something in between. Something primal. My blood ran cold. I'd heard of packs of wild dogs before. Packs of feral animals that hunted in the dark. I didn't know if these were dogs or something worse, but I knew I had to get out of there. I quickly unzipped the tent and crawled out, careful not to make any noise. The forest around me was silent now, as if everything was holding its breath. I grabbed my backpack, shoved it over my shoulder, and looked around. The pack of animals was still there, lurking in the shadows, watching me. I couldn't stay, not with them so close. With my heart pounding, I started to move. I kept low, crouching in the underbrush, trying to stay out of sight. My mind was racing. Where could I go? The nearest road was a mile away, and it was dark. I wasn't sure how far I could run without getting lost in the woods. But I couldn't stay here. As I moved deeper into the forest, the animals followed. I could hear them in the distance, moving quickly. I couldn't outrun them. I had to think. I remembered the ridge, a high spot just a little further on, where the trees cleared and I could see everything. I moved toward it, pushing through the brush as quietly as I could. The animals were getting closer now. I could hear their footsteps, the sound of their breathing. Finally, I reached the ridge and stopped to catch my breath. I looked back, but I couldn't see anything. I had no idea where they were. I had no idea how far I'd gone. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something big moving behind me, getting closer. I turned around, my heart racing. There was nothing there. The animals were gone. I don't know how I made it through the night. I huddled at the top of that ridge, cold and terrified, listening to the sounds of the forest, waiting for the creatures to return. But they didn't. By morning, they were gone. The woods were silent. I walked back to my camp as the sun rose, feeling the weight of what had happened. Whatever had been out there, it was real. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't just wild dogs. It was something else. Something I couldn't explain. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, not bothering to finish my breakfast, not even caring about the things I'd left behind. The forest was no longer a place of peace for me. It was a place full of hidden dangers I could never understand. I left that campsite without looking back, vowing never to return. And to this day, I never have. It was supposed to be just another camping trip. My friends and I had done it 100 times before, but this time felt different. Maybe it was because we chose a more remote location, one we had never been to before. The forest stretched out endlessly, thick with trees, and the air smelled like wet earth and pine. Our plan was simple: hike in, set up camp, and spend a few days in nature, away from everything else. We arrived at the trailhead around midday. The sun was high in the sky, the kind of day that felt warm without being oppressive. We packed our gear, checked our maps, and made sure we had enough food and water. There were 6 of us: me, my brother Nick, Sarah, the quiet one, Greg, the joker, and 2 others, Mike and Rachel. We had all been friends for years, and hiking together was something we did every summer. But this time, the area felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the trees felt too dense, the shadows too thick. The trail started out wide, a well-maintained path that cut through the forest with ease. As we hiked, we talked about random things, old stories from high school, what we'd be doing once we got back to town, and silly things like who was the worst cook among us. Of course, it was Greg. The path twisted and turned, and the further we went, the less we saw of other people. Soon, it was just us, the sound of our feet crunching the dirt beneath us, and the quiet hum of the forest. About 2 hours into the hike, we reached a clearing. It was a perfect spot for camp, with a small creek running through it, the water bubbling gently over smooth rocks. We set up our tents quickly, everyone eager to get the campfire going and enjoy the evening. As the sun started to dip, casting long shadows over the trees, we made our dinner. Just some simple pasta and canned vegetables, and sat around the fire. The evening passed slowly. The fire crackled, and the air turned cooler as the sun disappeared completely. It wasn't until the stars started to shine that I began to feel that nagging feeling again. It wasn't fear, but more like a sense that something was watching us. Every now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking just out of sight, but there was nothing. The others didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they didn't say anything. Greg made a joke about how we should be careful of bears, but that only made the strange feeling grow. We stayed up late that night, talking and laughing, until the fire began to die down. By then, the forest had grown silent. The usual nighttime sounds of animals seemed to have stopped. No owls, no rustling in the underbrush, just quiet, too quiet. Finally, we decided to call it a night. The stars were now completely visible, and the temperature had dropped significantly. We retreated to our tents, zipped up our sleeping bags, and tried to sleep. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up, but it was dark, too dark. The kind of dark that felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. At first, I thought I had just woken up to adjust my sleeping bag or something, but then I realized that there was something strange about the silence. It was as if the forest had gone completely still, as if it was holding its breath. The wind had stopped, and there were no sounds at all, not even the usual creaks of the trees. I lay there in the dark, listening. My heart began to race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stayed still, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I slowly unzipped my tent, just enough to peek outside. The moonlight filtered through the branches above, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. For a moment, I saw nothing, but then, in the distance, just on the edge of the clearing, I saw movement. At first, it was so subtle that I thought I had imagined it, but then it happened again. Something, or someone, was moving just inside the treeline, moving slowly, deliberately. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was there, and it was watching us. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it an animal? Person? My mind raced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was too intentional, too calculated. Whoever or whatever was out there knew we were here, knew we were asleep. I quietly zipped my tent back up and lay down again, my mind racing. What if it was just an animal? What if it wasn't? Should I wake the others? My thoughts swirled, and I couldn't settle on a course of action. The hours dragged by, and eventually, I fell back into a restless sleep. But the feeling of being watched never left. The next morning, everyone was up early, gathering around the campfire to eat breakfast. As I watched them, I tried to shake off the unease, but the tension in my chest remained. I didn't want to say anything, not yet. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but the entire day felt different. We packed up camp and began our hike back, but the strange feeling never lifted. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. We made our way down the trail, chatting and laughing, but something in the back of my mind kept telling me to look over my shoulder. Every time I did, there was nothing. Just the same dense forest, the same shadows stretching across the trail. By mid-afternoon, we were getting close to the trailhead. The familiar sound of traffic in the distance helped ease the tension a little. It was almost over. Just as I was starting to relax, I saw it again. A flash of movement in the trees off to the side of the trail. This time, it was closer, just out of the corner of my eye, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I couldn't be sure, but I thought I saw something watching us from behind a tree. I turned quickly to Nick, but when I looked back, whatever it was had disappeared. We continued walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The air was heavy now, thick with the sense of something just beyond my reach, something I couldn't see but could feel. As we rounded a corner on the trail, I heard a branch snap behind us. It was a sharp, distinct sound. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but again, there was nothing. No one. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. Finally, we reached the trailhead. The familiar sight of our cars parked at the edge of the forest was a relief, but it didn't completely ease the unease that had settled in my gut. As we loaded our gear into the cars, I kept glancing back at the trees. Had we been followed, or was it just my imagination? We drove back to town in silence, the feeling still hanging over me. When we got back to our apartment, I finally spoke up about what had been bothering me. I told Nick, Sarah, and the others about the movements I had seen in the trees, about the unsettling silence of the forest. To my surprise, they all admitted that they had felt it too, that same sense of being watched, that same feeling that something was out of place. We never went back to that spot in the woods. And the weirdest part? I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there in the forest was still watching, just beyond the treeline, waiting. But after that trip, I couldn't ever find that trail again, no matter how hard I looked. It was as if the forest had swallowed it up, taking everything with it, leaving only the memory of that strange, unsettling trip. That was the last time I went camping in those woods. Something about it, something about the way it all felt, made me realize that not all places are meant to be visited. Some things should stay hidden, deep within the forest, waiting for the next person who's curious enough to look. It was the middle of the summer when I decided to go camping with a group of friends. None of us were experienced campers, but we were eager for the kind of adventure you only get when you step away from everything that feels familiar. We were heading to a secluded spot in the woods about an hour's drive outside of town. No cell service, no lights from the city, just us and the great outdoors. We set off around noon. The sun was high and the weather was perfect. It was the kind of day where you could feel the warmth of the sun on your skin, but the breeze kept things from getting too hot. The car ride was filled with excitement and joking around. We passed through small towns and finally hit the dirt road that led to the campsite. The spot was remote, deep in the forest. There were no other campers around, and the silence was almost deafening when we stepped out of the car. We unloaded the gear, tents, sleeping bags, food, and all the essentials. The trees were so thick that the sunlight barely touched the forest floor. It felt like we were stepping into another world, one untouched by time. It was beautiful, peaceful, but also a little unsettling. Setting up camp didn't take long. We had a fire pit, a few tents, and a small cooking setup. The place looked like it could be straight out of an outdoor magazine. After the tents were up, we started the fire, and everyone sat around it, passing around snacks and telling stories. We were all a bit nervous at first, being out there with no one else around, but the night was young, and we tried to push away the uneasy feeling that lingered. As the evening wore on, the shadows in the trees grew longer, and the night air started to cool. The fire crackled and popped, and we all sat in the circle, listening to the forest around us. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The sounds of the forest came in waves, an owl hooting in the distance, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snapping of a twig underfoot. But nothing felt threatening, not yet. It wasn't until around 10 p.m. that things started to feel strange. By this time, the fire had burned low, and we were sitting around in the half-light, talking in quieter voices. The temperature had dropped significantly, and everyone was wrapped in jackets, their breath visible in the cold air. The wind had died down, and everything seemed still, too still. I had just started to nod off when I heard something, like a soft rustling in the bushes. I turned my head, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just a deer or some other animal moving through the woods. But then the noise came again, closer this time. It sounded deliberate, like something was moving in our direction. I sat up, fully awake now. I wasn't sure what I was hearing, but my instincts told me something wasn't right. The others noticed too. We all fell quiet, straining to hear whatever was making the sound. It was coming from the woods, just outside the reach of our campfire. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. Then came a noise that sent a chill through my spine. A low growl, almost a hum, but definitely not anything friendly. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a bear or a coyote. I had spent enough time in the woods to recognize animal sounds. But this was different. Deeper, more guttural, and more threatening. We all stared at each other, not knowing what to do. The sound came again, louder this time and closer. It was moving in a circle around our camp, almost as if whatever it was testing us, seeing how we would react. My friends sat frozen, wide-eyed and silent. The growling stopped for a moment, and in that silence, I could feel a presence. It was like the entire forest had paused, and it was holding its breath too. The tension was unbearable. I stood up slowly, my hands shaking. The others followed suit, and we all gathered near the center of the camp, trying to look out into the darkness, but seeing nothing. Suddenly, we heard a branch snap, and we all jumped. Whatever it was close, too close for comfort. My first instinct was to grab a flashlight, but there was no way to know where to point it. The forest was so thick, the light from the fire barely made it past the trees. Then came a noise that I'll never forget. A loud, tearing sound, like something big ripping through branches and brush. My heart pounded. That wasn't an animal. Whatever it was big, too big, and it was moving toward us, quick, and it wasn't trying to hide. We ran to the tents, fumbling in the dark. We could hear the heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, closer now, and I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I was sure it was something that wanted to hurt us, something large, something dangerous. We all huddled in the tents, zipping them up as tightly as we could. My mind raced, and I tried to think of a way to protect us, but there was no way to know what we were up against. I wanted to scream, to shout, but I knew that would only make things worse. If it was something hunting us, making noise would only draw attention. The noise outside the tent intensified, like something was pacing around, circling us. I could hear it moving from one side of the camp to the other, then back again. It was like it was toying with us, and that made the fear worse. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. I held my breath, straining to listen. The stillness was almost worse than the sounds had been. I don't know how long we waited in that tense silence, but it felt like hours. My heart was racing, and my skin felt cold, like ice. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to know what was out there. I grabbed the flashlight, and with my hands shaking, I crawled out of the tent as quietly as I could. The others whispered for me to stop, but I didn't listen. I had to see. I crept around the edge of the camp, the beam of light cutting through the trees. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I saw something, movement, deep in the woods, just outside the reach of the flashlight. It was big, but not the size of a bear. It moved on two legs, and it was walking slowly, cautiously. I froze. I wasn't sure what I was looking at. It was tall, much taller than any human I'd ever seen. It was covered in dark fur, and it had a shape that didn't look like any animal I knew. My heart stopped, couldn't breathe. My mind raced to make sense of it, but there was no way to explain what I was seeing. I backed away, my hands still shaking, and as I did, the creature turned its head, just enough for me to see its eyes. They were wide, dark, and cold. It stared at me for a long moment, then slowly turned and disappeared into the woods. I ran back to the tent, my legs trembling. I didn't say anything at first. I just sat down, staring at the others. They could tell something had happened, but I couldn't find the words to explain it. We stayed in the tents for the rest of the night, too afraid to move, too afraid to sleep. The creature, or whatever it was, never returned. The next morning, we packed up our things quickly, eager to get out of the woods. The sun was coming up, but the forest still felt cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back. The trees loomed behind us, dark and silent, and I had a sinking feeling that we hadn't just been unlucky. Something else had been out there, something that didn't belong in the world we knew, and it had watched us. It had been waiting for us. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. I don't think anyone would have believed me if I had, but I knew what I had seen, and it was real. I wasn't sure if I'd ever go back into the woods again. The fear lingered, even as we left the campsite behind. Something had been out there, and I wasn't sure if it would ever leave.